last week in that recorded lesson, I was talking about community structure. We essentially went through together but separate, right? Different attributes of community structure. Does anyone remember any of those attributes, any of those features that we can quantify, that we can talk about in terms of community?
Thinking about like the horizontal.
So the community, of course, has vertical and horizontal niches, but what can we measure about the community itself? So like if we're comparing two communities, we can compare this of each one.
How many members there are in each community?
Yeah. So how many different types of species, right? So species abundance, purely number of species. So we've seen this graph before. This is an environmental gradient. And so if we were to take a measurement, take a sample right here along this gradient, we would see that there are two different species, right? So that was the species abundance, right? If we were to measure right here, we would see that there are 4 different species, right? So purely the number of species, the abundance. Anything else we can measure? Yeah.
The amount of resources.
Okay, yeah, so the amount of resources, we can measure things like, biomass, we can measure things like, the number of primary producers, the number of plants in an area, okay? Within each species, right, along those lines, we can measure the relative abundance, right? So in this particular community is essentially 50-50, these two different species, right? We kind of expand that out a little bit. We can talk about species diversity, right? So I gave you a couple different metrics, a couple different ways that we can express species diversity. This is not something you'll have to calculate on the final, but you should be kind of familiar with the concept. Species diversity takes into account both the pure number of species, or the abundance, there are 2 species versus 4 species, but also how even those species are, right? So this community here does not have a lot of evenness, right? There are mostly this hypothetical species and very few of these hypothetical species, right? If there was more evenness, there would be 25% of each of them. Okay? So species diversity actually reflects both abundance as well as evenness. And then I started to talk a little bit about food webs. We can actually calculate the connectance, how many different connections there are between the different trophic levels within a community. Okay, so just different ways of expressing what is happening within an entire community. And of course, that Cottonwood video expanded that out to a lot more metrics that can be used in the field. Okay. Until now, we've been talking about community structure over space. Right? We know at this point that as you ascend in altitude, like in Arizona, like Eric talked about earlier this semester, you essentially see the communities shift from one distinct community to the next. Okay? So over space. We also know that as you get farther from a water source, right, in this case, maybe this is the marsh. And so as you get farther from a water source, the physical characteristics are going to change, right? There's going to be different amounts of stress, right? Different amounts of water, oxygen, nutrients, et cetera, within the soil. And so we get these distinct communities along a gradient, an environmental gradient. What is this concept called again?
Oh wait, I was just about to say that zonation first.
Yes, perfect, love it.
And I was thinking of that exact example in my head right before the image came up there.
Yes, you guys are so good at predicting what I'm going to say. I don't know if that means I'm too predictable or if you guys are just not smart.
That's just kind of my jam.
Okay, that is your jam.
No, it means that you know as professor that you already know what we like.
Right. So I think we have a pretty good concept at this point of how communities change over space or over environmental gradients. I think we can also appreciate at this point that as environmental conditions change, right, communities are going to change accordingly. And of course, we just spent quite a long time talking about how species work together or they oppose each other, right? Either there's no winners, one winner or two winners, right? Lots of different species interactions can further affect where species are going to be distributed and therefore community composition, right? Notice that this is the realized niche, not the fundamental niche. Today, our focus is going to be community structure changing through time. And so even if we keep on measuring the same place over and over again, the community is not going to be the same. Okay? And so this concept is called succession. This is a temporal change in the community at the same location. And so just as kind of proof of concept here, some scientists took a concrete block, right, and they put it in the water off the coast of California and essentially watched what happened. Right? So they noticed what species and their abundance kind of colonized this brand new surface over time. So the same exact surface, the same block, but what they saw was that different species colonized at different times. Okay, so we've been looking at graphs with an environmental gradient along the x-axis. Now the x-axis contains a timeline. Okay, so the beginning of the experiment, the block was just put into place, and the end of their measurements. So what you can see here, without really focusing on the species themselves, we can see that some species colonize right away, and they're very abundant. There is no competition here. They have a completely new surface in which to colonize. Okay? Soon, other species can start to take hold, and essentially this is going to increase the competition between the initial colonizers or pioneers and these newly colonizing species. Okay? As competition gets more and more intense, and as more and more species take hold onto this block, the initial species are essentially outcompeted as others become more abundant. Okay? So even though we are looking at the same exact structure, the community is not the same from one September to the next September. Okay? And so this is not some hypothetical scenario. This actually does mimic what is happening in the real world. In Southern California, in this intertidal zone, these rocks are constantly being turned over, therefore exposing substrate, exposing a rock surface that wasn't previously ideal for these photosynthesizers. Yeah.
Does it ever occur that the pioneer species drives away basically unsuccessful attempts of colonizing species?
Absolutely. Your book actually has an entire section on kind of these three different methods, different ideas about succession. And one of them is these guys are essentially making it much harder for these guys. Yeah, so it all depends on the situation. Yeah, it all depends, but definitely does happen. All right, so generally, what is initiating succession, that is this sequential development of communities, is a disturbance. Right, any thoughts on what a disturbance could be? What types of changes? Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts? Okay. So something is affecting the environment. The living creatures are being affected. What do you think? Any examples? Climate change. Climate change. Was that your answer?
No, introduction of an invasive species.
Yeah, absolutely. So invasive species, that's definitely a disturbance.
Natural disasters.
Natural disasters, that is a huge disturbance for sure.
Acidification due to the fact that can change the chemistry of the sediment.
Absolutely, yeah. So this physical change, so acidification of soil, acidification of water. I think I heard deforestation. Great, yeah, that's a huge habitat shift. Awesome, yes. So big disturbance, an asteroid hits. Right, so an Armageddon kind of situation here. That is obviously going to disturb the living community. Much more common, a volcano erupts, right? So in this case, there is actually new substrate, right? There wasn't an island here before, but now that the a volcano has erupted to a certain extent. Now there's new land emerging out of the water, and it doesn't have a community yet, right? So this can, of course, develop a community over time. Okay. Forest fires, deforestation, very much disturbing the current community. Even something as small as a tree falling down. That's, okay. So here we can see that a tree has been cut down, but similarly, if a tree falls down naturally, essentially, the environmental conditions on the forest floor are now completely different in this essentially large sun fleck, right? Than they are surrounding it, right? Different amounts of light, different variation in temperature over the day, right? This gap in the canopy is called a tree fall gap, and it is essentially a disturbance that is going to promote succession. And so in any of these situations, right, whether it's something as large as an asteroid or a volcano, or something as small as a tree falling in the forest, whether or not it makes a noise, right, it leaves an impact on the community. There is a predictable sequence of communities that are going to develop in the same place over time. Okay, so what we can see here is the initial exposed rock. Right, so maybe after a volcano has erupted or something, note that this rock is in each of these images. So we're not looking over space, we're looking over time. Initially, this rock is going to be colonized by lichens, by mosses. These guys aren't too picky about where they live. Soon enough, grasses, herbaceous plants, maybe tiny seedlings are going to take root. And then a forest community can take root of particular species, but these ones are outcompeted eventually by yet another community of forest trees. And so these steps in the development of the community, in this succession, these are called seral stages. So this is a seral stage, and this is a seral stage, and this is a seral stage, and each one has a pretty predictable composition of species. Together, this entire timeline, however long it's going to take, right? Usually this is years, sometimes decades or centuries, depending on what type of environment we're looking at. This entire timeline is called a seer. Okay, so the sequence of communities, which is comprised of multiple seral stages. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, very good. The end all be all here, right, is the climax community. Okay? And so this is the most mature forest. Generally, this is not permanent. There's always kind of minor disturbances. So essentially, when this tree falls or is cut down, that is going to kind of rewind the clock or revert to an earlier seral stage. Okay, so one of these trees is cut down, there's a tree fall gap, and so now there's a lot of competition by these smaller plants. And so in that tiny space, you're going to have this community and then this community. So it kind of rewinds the clock here. Oh, sorry, too fast.
Sorry.
Oh, it's all good. The disturbances we've talked about so far are kind of covering a wide range of severity, right? A tree fall gap, right, really small, and generally there is still a community that already exists down here, right? So it just has to grow. It doesn't have to like make soil or actually change the physical structures of this environment. On the other hand, when a volcano erupts, that is completely changing the environment. It is covering over any community that used to be there, if any. And so there is a lot more that has to happen. So we can divide succession into two main types, depending on the severity of the disturbance. Go to the slide. The first type of succession is what happens after there's a really severe disturbance. So primary succession, essentially going back to the basics. In primary succession, this starts with a new environment. There is no existing community. For the most part, there's no existing soil. Okay? So remember that soil isn't just, these particles of rock. Instead, it also contains organic matter. It also contains living organisms. Okay? So after a volcano, there isn't any of that. Okay? Last year was particularly active as far as volcanic activity goes. This is one of the first ones from last year, and it just kept going from there, because we weren't dealing with anything else last year, right? So lots of new environments were created by volcanoes erupting last year and even into this year. When tectonic plates shift, okay, they often expose underlying material, which of course does not have organic material. It does not have living creatures within it. Okay, so this is a new substrate on which life can colonize, but it needs to go through these steps first. Okay. When glaciers melt, this is essentially exposing land that hasn't been able to see the light of day for a very long time. There is not actively living creatures within this soil. And so something like newly exposed land after a glacial melt is also going to undergo primary succession. Okay. Parking lots, right? They start off with no living material, right? Just bare substrate. But as we know, especially if they're not being driven over all the time, life finds a way. Right? So it always comes back to that. So you start to see cracks in the parking lot, and then little grass is going to pop up through there. Parking lots are undergoing primary succession. So for all of these situations, right, houses or trees growing in houses, grass growing in parking lots, new forests growing where a volcano has erupted, essentially this requires seeds, right, to immigrate from other places, and ultimately begin the long process of soil formation. Okay, so it takes a long time. So primary succession is just on a little bit of a different timeline than other minor disturbances. Okay, so this is approximately what's going to happen. Parking lot, lava, whatever, is bare inorganic rock. Okay. The very first things that are going to colonize are generally called pioneer species. This is kind of a blanket term. Sometimes this refers to species that colonize in secondary succession as well, but generally the first things that are going to come into a newly exposed environment are pioneer species. Okay. In general, lichens are able to colonize first. We can see them attaching to just bare rock. They don't need soil, they don't need anything else. Remember that this is a symbiotic relationship between a photosynthesizer and a decomposer. And so together they are able to live even without soil. Right? Everything else needs some kind of soil or to eat something that uses soil. Lichen does not. And so generally lichens are the very first things that are going to enter into a new environment. Generally, when these ultimately die, they are going to provide organic matter that then breaks down into soil. Okay? And the soil can then be used by other types of plants. Okay? Often together with the lichen are mosses. Okay? So these are also really robust to stress. If you remember from D&E, these are the plants that colonize land first. Of course, there wasn't a lot of soil, there wasn't a lot of organic matter, and so these guys still retain those abilities. They can colonize the thinnest, crummiest of soil and ultimately build it up over time. Okay, again, they die, thickening the existing soil. And so what we can see here as we go through time is that the soil layer on top of, in this case, the bedrock, the soil is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker because of plant matter breaking down and donating its tissues to the growing layer of soil. This, essentially the life and ultimate decomposition of these organisms enables other types of species to colonize. In general, it's things like grasses that grow first. These guys are really versatile. They don't need a lot to grow. They can grow really fast. And they immediately can utilize the minimal soil that's been built up by these guys here. An example of this that might not seem so extreme, but is in fact kind of extreme, are sand dunes, right? So all the time you have waves washing up new parent material, right? So sand is essentially just broken down rock. It is inorganic substrate, and so it does not have an existing community on it, okay? So as waves deposit sand onto a beach, and windward slopes, right? So the wind is also creating these dunes. Essentially, the very first things that can colonize are grasses, right? So very quick growing, versatile species here. Essentially, their roots are going to stabilize the dunes, right? And in stabilizing those dunes, essentially other types of species, right? So more robust grass here, conifers, and ultimately hardwoods as well. So trees can ultimately grow because the dunes have been stabilized by beach grass here. Okay, the grasses, of course, are relatively quickly outcompeted by these other types of plants. Okay? And when I say quickly, I don't mean like weeks. Note, we're talking centuries here. This image is Sandy Hook. So I'm kind of off towards New York City there. What we can see is, dunes forming on this side. And because this land has been protected for so long, we don't have, people running all over the dunes and moving the dunes to build more houses and all that kind of good stuff. The trees have actually been able to colonize. So this land is actually going through these successional stages. Okay? And actually, this area in particular has the oldest American holly forest, I think in North America. And so that is one of the many types of trees that further stabilize these dunes. Also, new substrate is formed along rivers. When rivers flow down a slope, right, in this case through the mountains here, along the way the waters are eroding the banks, right? So essentially they are picking up all of this parent material, eroding away the rocks, and carrying all that parent material farther downstream. When the river enters into the floodplain or into this larger open area, not through this channel here, essentially all of that parent material precipitates out of the water and is deposited in a couple different types of structures, but this one is pretty common. This is called an alluvial fan, essentially when the waters are pretty high. And so during a wet season, the sediments can wash out across the entire floodplain here and deposit this material everywhere. And so again, this is pretty common structure to see in various environments. And essentially this parent material isn't yet colonized. Right? It doesn't have its own community. Of course, it might contain all sorts of nutrients. It contains different types of particulates, decomposing leaves and such. So it is delivering those types of nutrients, but it is still new material, right? It needs to be colonized. And so this would also undergo primary succession. Okay? We can call this soil alluvium, or we can call it alluvial soil. So both of those words are commonly used in this situation. If you look at the Mississippi River Valley, essentially, the river, right, isn't that wide, but in fact, because of the changing levels of the water, because of where it is flowing, right, through the Great Plains, right, lots and lots of organic matter, lots of very loose soil. All of that is picked up into the very muddy looking Mississippi. You guys seen the Mississippi before? It's pretty brown, right? So lots and lots of sediment is suspended within the Mississippi River. when it floods, it can deposit this sediment out into the valley. And so you might imagine that the valley is incredibly fertile because all of that, rich soil from farther upstream is deposited on either side. That makes sense? Yeah, so lots of nice, rich material to grow a new community. Glaciers. As I mentioned before, when glaciers recede, it kind of opens up this new environment for colonization by different types of plants and their subsequent animals. In addition to that, however, when snow falls, it is essentially compacted into the glacier. Right? So the glacier kind of moves a little bit in this compaction process, and it kind of glides over the surface of the land a little bit. In the process, this is the real term, it is plucking up substrate from underneath it. Right? This is inorganic, for the most part, inorganic. So lots of rocks, lots of silt, and that substrate is displaced in a couple different ways. First of all, when the glacier recedes, whatever was trapped up within that ice is just dropped wherever it is. Right? So if you go a little farther north and you're just hiking through the woods and you see normal granite, and then a random massive rock that looks like it has no reason to be there, that is glacial till, right? It was just dropped by the glacier. And of course, it is not colonized by anything yet. And so primary succession can begin. The other thing is outwash. So as we can see here, at the base of this glacier, there's a lot of extra material, right, that isn't colonized yet. We can see the clear forest, and then we can see this outwash plain. Okay, so essentially, as the glacier melts seasonally, usually, anything that is trapped within that ice can be washed away, right? And then it is deposited on the land below. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. So let's look at how communities change over time adjacent to a receding glacier. Okay, so this example is from Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Scientists have been recording the recession since the 1700s, so a lot of data. Also, they have been recording community composition for about that long. So what we can see here is this outline is the American part of the glacier, right? So this is Canada. This is the Alaskan part of the glacier. All of the colors combined are the extent of what the glacier was in the 1760s. Okay. Over time, of course, this has been melting, it has been receding. And so the first pieces of ice to melt are these here in light green. Okay, so that kind of disappeared first. Therefore, that soil has been exposed the longest. Okay. Next was, see this darker blue in here, right? So little tiny pieces of the glacier were still maintained, or actually, no, sorry, this one. This part was next, right? And then, these little patches, and all that remains today is that right there, right? So I bring this up because these different places surrounding the glacier have been exposed, right? Exposed to the world, not covered by ice anymore for varying amounts of time. All of the data combined essentially gives us this picture here, right? At first, there's very little amount of vegetation that is able to colonize. The most abundant species are alders, okay? So they're kind of the pioneer species here. But then over time, as you move along through the decades, what we see is this shift in the community composition, right? Spruce becomes very abundant next, after like 100, 150 years. And then finally, the hemlocks are going to become dominant, right? Ultimately outcompeting all of these pioneer species. Okay? And so the timeline here matters. Or let me draw your attention back to this timeline because, for example, this portion here has been exposed for the longest, right? For a couple hundred years now. It has a different community. So it has the spruce and hemlock community here because it has been exposed the longest, right? So what this landscape is showing us is that there is actually a mosaic of different communities based on how long they have been proceeding through those several stages. Okay? So this is called a chronosequence or a chronosphere, depending on what source you're looking at. So yes, this landscape is undergoing succession, but not all at the same time. All of these different places are at different stages along that sphere. That makes sense? Okay. Of course, as always, we talk about the plant community because the plant community is what gives this structure to the environment. But we also know that there are animals that come along with those different types of plants. This data is from the same study. So the same paper here. What we can see is brown bears and black bears. Okay. In general, brown bears look like they are perfectly comfortable in recently glaciated areas, right? So where the glacier has just receded and there might be a community of alders and willows and other quickly growing plants, right? Brown bears, completely happy there. But black bears require a young forest, so maybe here, or an older forest, so the pure hemlock and spruce. Okay, so different animals, as we were talking about before class started, the different animals have different requirements. Okay, so they are also included in this succession, but generally we talk about these communities in terms of the vegetation, like we've seen before. Any questions about primary succession? No. All right. Secondary. This is essentially progression through these different community stages, these different seral stages, after a smaller disturbance. Okay, so something like a fire seems very intense, but really there's still a community intact. Okay, so after a fire, secondary succession could proceed. Things like floods or hurricanes, anything that does not completely wipe out the community down to bare rock. Because there is some kind of community structure, there might be a seed bed still present, and of course there's still soil, the recovery is a lot faster. So instead of looking in terms of hundreds of years like here it might be decades or maybe up to 150. So much faster. Just kidding. So I'm going to give you two different examples. One is in New England, and the other, I'm going to talk about the pine barrens and talk about succession here. So to start with New England, essentially, initial colonists cleared vast tracts of land, trying to initiate a strong agricultural presence. Right, so lots and lots of land cleared in places like New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts. Over time, people realized that, oh my gosh, the soil is full of rocks. It is a pain to do anything with agriculturally. And so they tried cattle, right? That was also kind of a pain. So ultimately, within the last century, most of New Hampshire has been allowed to just go back to the wild and allowed for more trees to return. And of course, that actually brings New England quite a lot of money. Like people drive a long way to see pretty trees. Good to go. So in this image, we can see this image is from 1940s or so. This is the same area like 10 years ago. Okay, so again, life finds a way. The forest will return even after it has been mowed and grazed and tilled up year after year. So, right, initially, settlers tilled the soil, I realized that was a terrible idea, started letting it go back to what it once was, like, yep, I'm done with this. And so initially, what colonized this space, right, which already had soil, right, not fantastic soil, but soil nevertheless, it had a seed bed, right? It had forests kind of surrounding it, and therefore seeds could come in from the sides, right? So the first plants that would colonize are things like grasses and wildflowers. Think like weedy things, and lots of weedy stuff. Okay? From there, plants like white pines and poplars, also hemlocks, start to grow. Okay? And finally, once there is a nice canopy, essentially the environment has changed. There's a lot of shade. The temperature is going to be pretty consistent over the course of the day because the canopy kind of acts like a nice insulating layer, right? Instead of, super hot in the middle of the day and super cold at night, the forest kind of buffers that temperature shift, allowing other species that are a little bit more delicate at first, things like beech and maple, to grow up in the understory and ultimately take over the entire canopy. So here we can see the different seral stages of the New England community. Okay. When you are walking around the woods in New England, you can see kind of this transition, right? So these are hemlocks, right? They're kind of a mid-succession species. It's nice and dark, damp, and lovely. And in the understory, here we can see things like maple and beech that are growing up. So these are ultimately going to be the climax community, but they can only really take hold in the understory of these mid-successional plants. Okay, does that make sense? Cool. So long ago, we talked about shade tolerance. We talked about different plant attributes that would make them really good in different types of environment. So given what we know, let's think about the difference between early successional species versus later successional species. And I'm going to try to write on the board here. If you are an early successional plant, what kind of dispersal do you think you should have? Right? Do you think you should have a few big seeds or lots of little seeds? Yeah, lots of little seeds. That makes sense. So, and I'm going to try to write on the screen here so I don't have to roll up the board a million times. So you have lots of seeds and they should be pretty little, right? As opposed to maybe fewer seeds, right? But they might be pretty big, right? And so maybe big seeds have kind of a bigger lunch pack from mom, right? So parent plant packs a lot more material for the developing offspring, right? So these are more robust, but they don't really get distributed very far, very fast. How about growth rate? Should early successional species grow really fast or really slow?
Should always grow really fast considering every other early successional species is also going to send out lots of little seeds.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
It's the land grab. It's everybody rushing to get to their spot.
Later successional species, do they have to grow fast?
No, they are growing more slowly.
Yeah. So they have the time, right? They don't need to compete so quickly. So we'll just say slower. How about shade tolerance? Right? Really going back there. Are early successional species tolerant of being in the shade?
Intolerant.
Intolerant, yeah. So they're intolerant. They need lots of sun. Yeah. Lots and lots of sun. And that ultimately allows them to grow fast, right? They need lots of sun, lots of energy in order to grow this quickly.
So what I'm getting is early successional species are burning the candle at both ends.
They are. And I think the next one here shows that they kind of taper out pretty quickly though, right? They're shade tolerant, they can grow in the shade. Size. You think these early ones should be big or small?
Small.
Yeah, right. They're growing super fast, right? Just pretty much trying to set up their little spot in the world. but they don't really get very big, right? They kind of tap out pretty small. Later successional species?
Much.
Yeah,
We have,
like huge trees.
let's see, there's the oldest tree in the world. I can't remember.
They grow really fast. They can't handle being shaded out by others. They stay relatively small, so do they live a long time or not?
No.
No, so they have a pretty short lifespan. I'm going to say that these are for the most part annuals. Right? If you have a garden, that's an A. There we go. You know that these plants have to be replanted every year, so they're actually reseeding themselves with all of those lots of little seeds, oftentimes wind dispersed seeds every single year. And so they don't come back again and again, they have to reestablish. Right, so if these are annuals, you might imagine these are perennials. Structure. Do early successional species have time to build up lignin, to build up this really strong, robust trunk? No. So these are herbaceous plants for the most part, right? There's always exceptions, but these are herbaceous. Okay. So things like grasses, things like wildflowers, as opposed to like trees, right? These are woody. Right, so woody, they invest a lot of energy into strength. Right? So they're building a trunk, they're building really strong branches. These things take time. Okay? So they're slow growing, but I guess the summary here is these go for quality over quantity, and these go for quantity over quality. Your book gives a few more details. Essentially, this chart here is contrasting the different physiological characteristics that make plants kind of really good at colonizing early or kind of taking their time. Okay, so just to highlight a couple things here. Early successional plants, those seeds, yes, are abundant. They are mostly small. They're often dispersed by the wind, but also they are actually triggered to germinate, to sprout by a lot of light, right? They like a lot of light. They need a lot of light. So there might be a lot of these seeds, right, in the leaf litter, but if it is dark, right, so if there's a mature forest over them, the seeds are dormant. But as soon as the canopy is taken away because of tree falls, because of deforestation, because of forest fires, essentially, those seeds are immediately going to germinate. Okay. Also, fluctuating temperatures. Remember that the forest kind of insulates the forest floor. And so if all of a sudden it's really, really hot on the ground because there's no canopy offering shade, those seeds are going to germinate. Again, this shade tolerance concept from way back when, these early successional plants aren't very good in the shade as opposed to the late successional plants. But on the other hand, when there is a lot of light, they can photosynthesize a lot. Finally, I want to point out that the early successional plants are really good at acclimating to whatever the conditions are. So, you know, fluctuating temperatures, lots and lots of light, forest fires, right, of course, are really damaging, but early successional plants can do it. They can acclimate pretty quickly. These ones really don't. Okay. Also, there are often pretty limited resources in these disturbed environments. And so early successional plants are really good at snatching up anything that is actually available. And so I mentioned this earlier, but your book proposes that there are three kind of different models for how succession can progress. And the one that seems to be most applicable to eastern forests like those in New England is the facilitation model. Essentially, these early successional plants are really good at colonizing first, and they are going to physically change the environment, enabling or facilitating, as the name says, these late successional plants to grow. Okay, so as we can see here, like I pointed out, the hemlocks, they are relatively early successional or mid-successional plants, and they really like a lot of light. Okay, they don't grow well in the shade, but they are great at producing shade. And so again, when you walk through a hemlock forest, it is very dark, which is what these late successional plants need in order to establish. Right? Ultimately, they're going to become part of the canopy, but when they're young, they need a lot of protection. Right? So it is physically the early successional plants that change the physical characteristics of the environment that facilitate the later successional plants to grow. The pine barrens, we've talked about a lot at this point. Let's talk about their succession. There's a lot of different ways that the pine barrens, of course, are disturbed. We've talked about a lot of them. Of course, we talked about clear cutting, building textile plants on like Fred, all that kind of good stuff, right? Again, hypothetical scenario. Agriculture, timber, and fire, of course, is a major disturbance that we're going to talk about. So lots of different ways that the pine barrens are disturbed. There are different pioneer species. Of course, grasses really are the first ones that take hold again after a disturbance. In parking lots, in the forest, everywhere, grasses are often first in secondary succession. The shrubs or trees that take hold next are two different species. The eastern red cedar, which is actually a misnomer, it's actually juniper, but the common name is eastern red cedar. These are these like fluffy brownish green plants that you see all over the place around here. They are great at providing cover for birds, right, small mammals. They provide a valuable food source for birds and small mammals. Right? So essentially they are attracting animals out into a recently disturbed area. Right? And of course we know that animals are great seed dispersers, so they can not only disperse the seeds of the eastern red cedar, but also anything else that the animals have recently eaten. Okay, so this is kind of a clever way of attracting animals to repopulate the area. So eastern red cedars, characteristic pioneer species, will not grow in the shade. I tried. I was young and foolish. They did not grow in the forest. I wanted to save them. Pitch pine, the other one, right, which we know all about. We hugged a bunch a few months ago now. Pitch pines are also pioneer species, right? So they are going to grow in open areas, generally after completely clearing the land via fire, via development via timber, right? So both of these grow fast, they need a lot of light, they don't handle shade very well. Okay.
In this video, we are going to follow the successional pathway in South Jersey, starting of course with early succession. So this is in the year or two following a major disturbance event. What we're going to see is pioneer species, things like grasses, pitch pine, and eastern red cedar colonizing the land that was previously disturbed. And so our first example is this field here. It was last disturbed about a year and a half ago with a mower. And so what we can see is lots of grasses, of course, and right in the foreground here is an eastern red cedar. And so that's a year or two of growth. They do grow very quickly and create some nice vertical habitat to attract animals. Another example is the land right across from the movie theater and the Hamilton Mall. This was cleared about 5 years ago. It was a fully mature forest with pitch pine, oak, and hickory that was cleared for development that never really happened. Right? They built a Starbucks there just a year ago. But this is what remains. And so what's happening in both of these different examples is that the land was cleared, right, with a mower or with chainsaw, and so now that land in between, or that is surrounded by forest, has to be repopulated by seeds carried by animals, right, and also carried by the wind. And so in the top part of this image here, we can see that there are animals that venture out into this open area. We'll see in just a moment some of the animals that are really good at this and they really like to be out in the open, but either way, they are going to disperse seeds out farther and farther from the forest. And those plants, right, so the grasses, the eastern red cedar, the pitch pine, are all going to start to grow up. And as they do so, they are going to create vertical structure. They are going to literally change the climate on the ground to be more protective for more mature forest species. So species that would never venture out into an open field, they must be protected by both shade and by the physical environment that a tree or a shrub or even grass that is laid over can provide. And so what we can see at the bottom of this image is those initial pioneer species growing taller and taller and taller, and over time closing in that canopy. Okay, and so going back to that site across from the mall by the new Starbucks, what we can see here is in the background what this forest used to be and also what is still existing now. So this is still supporting the birds and the lizards and the bats that are going to be spreading these seeds out into the field. Okay, and so this savanna really is colonized only by grasses, right, which definitely attract a lot of pollinators, and also these pitch pines. And so we can actually see some pitch pines in the background that are still providing the seeds to this site. And so what types of organisms are really important in South Jersey savannas, right? So these early successional grasslands. Well, we actually have a couple species that are threatened, right? So the grasshopper sparrow and the red-headed woodpecker up above in the two corners. Both of these are threatened species. Both of these absolutely require grasslands in order to be able to hunt, in order to be able to live. Eastern cottontails, so these are rabbits that are very common around here. They generally aren't found deep in the forest. They might burrow at the edge of a forest, but generally they are going to eat grasses that are found in the savanna. And so these organisms, of course, are great vectors for seed dispersal. Grasses and wildflowers, the weedy things, are great at attracting pollinators. Right? So we actually have a couple pretty exciting butterfly species that we can see there in the middle, and of course their predators. Birds, such as flycatchers, actually perch on the edge of the forest, and they fly out, scoop up some insects, and take them back into the forest. And so they love to hunt at the interface between forest and savanna. What we can see down in the left corner is a quail, and quails are essentially a tasty snack for all sorts of different predators, and so they respond to this by actually living only in the grasslands. They almost create tunnels in the fallen over grass, right? So they can run around under the grasses and not actually be susceptible to getting hunted by something like a kestrel off to the right. In the quail picture, we can actually see that they build their nests from fallen down grasses as well. Okay. And finally, the American kestrel we can see here has hunted a lizard. He's very excited about that. All right, so now let's go back to Stockton. All right, and so what I want to point out is that for couple decades, this corner here at the entrance to Stockton was just an open field. Now, of course, Stockton has started to mow this area, but we can still see the remnants of succession behind. So if we go back to our successional pathway, what we can see is that if we allow those early successional forests or savannas to keep on growing, those little plants, right, so the red cedar and the pitch pine, are going to grow into shrubs. Right, and so what we'll see here next is that the pitch pine is going to keep on growing tall, and in the understory we're going to see that there are other plants that are going to come into play. So we could see the bushy red cedar. We can also see in the foreground here that there are some oaks still holding onto their leaves that are growing in the understory. These have to be sheltered by other plants when they first start growing. So these are definitely mid to late successional plants, right? So here we see another oak, couple oaks actually, with the fluffy brown leaves in the foreground, and again they are sheltered by these pioneer species, which of course have grown a lot over time to be able to facilitate the growth of these more mature forest species. And of course we can still see the red cedar, which was part of this early successional forest, but now has grown up to be a more mature forest. We can also see some remnants of this at home in our parking lots, right? Here we can see oaks, which are growing in the understory, protected by the pine trees up above. Right, so the dark almost black bark is the pitch pine. We can see that before we had parking lots here, this forest was dominated by pitch pines, and now it is growing and allowing the progression to a mature forest. Now, on our flowchart here, we see that if there is no fire, right, so we're not burning our parking lots, what we can see is that the oak and hickory are going to become dominant. You'll still see a lot of pitch pines, but for the most part, you start to see the appearance of these other types of species. Again, the oaks and hickories, you'll be able to see the leaves on at this time of year. All right, so here we have, again, on campus. In the understory, we see the kind of fluffy purplish plant that is a wild blueberry or huckleberry, highbush blueberry, and in the background we see green evergreens. Those are called mountain laurel, and they provide great cover for deer. We can also see in the understory oaks and hickories and pitch pines in the overstory. So here, again, we are progressing from mid-successional to a late successional forest. Okay, now what happens if we just keep on disturbing that mid-successional forest? And actually, South Jersey forests are very much adapted to this type of condition. Right? So if we, for example, mow or graze a early to mid-successional forest, as has been done here, what we see is that the savanna keeps on being kind of knocked back. We can see in the background here the red cedars and the pitch pines. Those have not been mowed, and so they serve as a great contrast to what disturbance can actually do. Right, so off to the right here, these red cedars are on their way to being a mid-successional forest. And the mowed regions are where the disturbance keeps on taking place. And so let us cut to the field, what is now a field, where CVS is in. What we can see in the foreground is the construction, right, disturbance, and in the background we can see what this field used to look like, right? So very much on its way to being a mid to late successional forest. Another type of disturbance, which doesn't necessarily clear cut, is roads. Right? So what you can see is a mid to late successional forest surrounding this road which has been built through. And so along the edges of the road we can see pioneer species like the eastern red cedar and also the pitch pine. So if we go back to our successional pathway, we see that the mature forest with oaks and hickories is what happens if there is no fire. And so the Pine Barrens of South Jersey is a very unique ecosystem in that the dominant forest type is not oaks and hickories as would be expected within this type of climate, but in fact it is the pines. It is the same exact pioneer species that begins the successional pathway. And so the reason why this is the case is because the disturbance regime is so intense with fires historically every 3 to 5 years. Essentially the oaks and hickories are not resistant to fire and they don't produce seeds within that time frame. So a 3-year-old oak plant is not going to be producing acorns. However, pitch pines can start to produce acorns within 3 years, it has been shown. Also, pitch pines are adapted in a lot of other ways to actually be resistant to fire, and we're going to take a look at that. And so, mature forests in South Jersey, particularly within the Pine Barrens, have adapted to a frequent fire regime, and as a result, the mature forests are pitch pine dominant. Or dominated. What we will also see in these pitch pine forests are things like lichen and mosses. Carnivorous plants are really common in these mature forests as well. So what we're going to see here is a couple different forests within the Pine Barrens. You should take a look at how abundant these pitch pines are, even though these forests are, well over 100 years old. Okay, as opposed to what we see in our parking lots. All right, so what we see here is some tea berries, which are very taste like winter fresh gum. We also see my dog Ted, but what I want to point out is just how many pitch pines there are in this forest. Right, you might see 1 or 2 oaks, but for the most part, it's all pitch pine. Next, here's some mosses with all the little spore phytes. So these guys are just about to release their spores into the world. And again, lots and lots of pitch pine. And here is some what is called fruticose lichen. All right, and what we can see in this particular video is actually a tree fall gap. Right, so there's actually trees falling down all the time, leaving these gaps in the canopy and allowing these little sapling pitch pine trees to recolonize. We've seen 2 different mature forest types in South Jersey. We have seen the oak hickory forests and we have seen the pitch pine forests. Now, every time you see a pitch pine forest, that indicates that fire has had an important role in that particular ecosystem. Oak hickory forest, which of course have pitch pines within them, have not had fire as a major player in that particular ecosystem. And so what this should indicate to you is that pitch pine is adapted to fire and maybe even requires fire in order to be successful, whereas the hardwoods like oak and hickory are not adapted to fire. And so I am going to show you a clip that I made to demonstrate how pitch pines in particular are adapted to fire in just one way, and there of course are many ways, but one way in which pitch pines are adapted to fire as compared to some other pine species. This is a demonstration of how fire affects 2 different species of pine, both of which can live in the climate of South Jersey. Both can live in the soil conditions, but what makes these 2 different pine species different is their adaptations to fire. And the first thing that we're going to see is a pitch pine cone. So the one that you saw on the right, when the pitch pine cone is exposed to heat of a fire for even just a second or 2, what we see is that those scales, which were formerly closed up, now are loosened, right? So the resin that actually kind of glues these scales together melts away, given exposure to fire, and actually opens the cone. And so as we can see on the right, after the fire, the cone is open and the seeds can therefore be spread. However, when we go back and we do the same exact thing to the white pine, which is not as adapted to fire, what we see is we can put it in the fire for just a second or 2, and immediately the eastern white pine is a fiery inferno. And so this fire is going to destroy the pine cone as opposed to opening the pine cone and allowing its seeds to actually be spread. So, just to drive this point home, we can do the same thing again with the pitch pine cone. Again, the scales are closed, and we can keep it in the fire for quite a long time. Right? So this just keeps going on, and the pine cone just won't catch on fire. And so ultimately, it's going to catch flame just a little bit, but still not the fiery inferno that we saw with the eastern white pine. And so, once again, the pitch pine cones are actually benefited by being exposed to a fire. Okay, and so when we actually expose them for an even longer period of time, what we see is that those scales completely detach, and so now each one of these little scales with the seed at the base is able to blow in the wind and therefore disperse even farther than it did before. Okay, and so what we see here is yet another example of an evolutionary trade-off of serotinous cones. And so you can see at the bottom of this image that the serotinous cones and evolutionary trade-off are blue and underlined, meaning that they are important vocabulary words for us. The trade-off of this trait is that, if we look to the right, pitch pines, their seeds are not really released without fire, right? They need a fire to be a regular part of their environment. If not, their seeds just aren't readily dispersed. And so the next generations of pitch pines will not be able to thrive because there aren't seeds for colonization. On the other hand, though, eastern white pines do very well in areas without a lot of fire. Right? So here we can see that the pine cones are always open. This is how they come off of the tree, and so the seeds are already exposed to the outside world, and they can grow as soon as the conditions are right. And so these white pines do very well in areas that do not have a lot of fire. However, if the white pines are exposed to fire, the entire cone is burnt up, and they cannot recolonize that area after a fire because there is no seed bed. Okay, but of course the pitch pines, they can thrive after a fire, not only because the fire actually opens up the cones and allows for the seeds to spread, but also the fire is going to destroy the competition. Okay, so both of these are equally viable species, but pitch pine is very much adapted to an area with frequent fires, whereas white pine cones, which are not serotinous, they are not. While forest fires are a critical part of maintaining a pitch pine forest, the more and more people that move into this area, the more forest fires have to be controlled, and for centuries they were in fact prevented. And so what happened was that, first of all, the pine barrens kind of shrunk. Right, so you start to see the encroachment of more and more oak hickory forest in the absence of fire to maintain this very unique ecosystem. But also, anytime there is an actual forest fire, it is just out of control, right? So much leaf litter, including, of course, actual leaves and also pine cones, pine needles, sticks, all sorts of things build up on the forest floor. And so when a forest fire does actually occur, it is really hard to control. And so, if you drive through the pine barrens, and even if you drive through campus, you will see evidence, as we're seeing here, of what are called controlled burns. Now, these are providing a lot of the good aspects of fire, right? So opening serotinous cones, decreasing the number of competitors, also super cool things like reducing the number of ticks that are going to be present in the following year. So all these wonderful things of fire, but in a very controlled way. And so in the event of an actual forest fire, it is a lot easier to control and put the fire out because there's much less leaf litter, there's less of a thick understory to allow the fire to what is called crown, or actually go up to the tops of the trees and actually kill the trees instead of doing all the beneficial things that it can do on the forest floor. And so that's why, driving around campus, especially in the spring, you might see that there are controlled burns happening.
The frequency of disturbance can change the diversity of a community. Okay, so what we can see here is, of course, time on the x-axis, population size of 3 different species. At each disturbance, we see that these 3 species are able to colonize. Another disturbance, they have to recolonize. Another disturbance, they have to recolonize. Okay, so if there is frequent enough disturbance, diversity never really gets very high. On the other hand, if the community is never disturbed, okay, so here we can see one disturbance way back when. The same 3 species can colonize. These are pioneer species maybe. And then the later successional species can colonize as they outcompete the pioneers. Okay, so once again, we end here with 3 species, hypothetically, and 2 species, really, so not that much diversity. And so there's kind of a sweet spot. Okay, so a medium level of disturbance. Right, so here we have a disturbance. The 5 early and later species are going to colonize. Right, before all of the pioneers completely die out, there is another disturbance event. And so we end here with 4 or 5 species as opposed to 3 or 2. Okay, so an intermediate level of disturbance really does produce the highest diversity. And so this is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. If the goal is a lot of diversity, regular disturbance or patches of disturbance throughout the community, throughout the landscape is the way to do it. And so that is actually going to be what we talk about a lot next Tuesday, this idea of patchiness and multiple disturbed environments and how they all work together to ultimately increase diversity. Mount St. Helens in Washington erupted, the big one, on May 18th, 1980. The force of the blast was able to topple the trees in the entire area, right? They kind of look like matchsticks. This is not fir, those are trees from up above. Also, of course, the ash and lava was able to cover the existing community. We can see, you know, some of the forest has been pushed down over here, but generally this is their substrate, right? No community is existing there for now. So absolutely devastating, but again, life finds a way. So these images are, again, approximately the same spot over 20 years. Well, actually, 24 years from the eruption. And so we can see that it changes over time. Here, just like a tiny little fluff of green. Over time, there's some shrubs, some herbaceous plants, and then finally, right, and this is even more developed now, we can see a pretty high level of diversity. The largest trees are right here along the road, right? So just like I said before, people bring seeds, right? We disperse seeds, and so that's probably what's happening there along the road. Okay. What type of succession is this? Primary or secondary? Primary, very good. So all of the successional changes that we've been talking about so far are considered to be autogenic. That is, it is the community itself that automatically self-generate, autogenic, a change in environmental conditions. Right? So as the first shrubs start to grow, they create more shade, and therefore the shade tolerant species can grow in the understory. All of those, again, physical changes, environmental changes are autogenic. They automatically happen because of some kind of a biological condition. Of course, light and nutrient availability are key here. Right? So we see that in the forest. We even see that in aquatic environments. Speaking of which, kind of a throwback to first couple weeks in class together, we read a study about eutrophication, right? How humans are affecting eutrophication. And there was one graph in that study that talked about benthic community succession. I know this is a long time ago, but I just want to use this as an example of aquatic successional stages. Okay, so what we can see here is the several stages of an aquatic ecosystem. Okay? When an area is first being colonized, generally the sediment is not very oxygenated. Okay? So really not much oxygen around. There are certain species that are capable of living in that type of environment. Right? So these would be considered the pioneer species. And so they are not necessarily good at spreading lots of little tiny seeds. They're not necessarily good at changes in temperature, right? Those are terrestrial qualities. In this actually marine ecosystem, the qualities that these guys can live in is deoxygenated sediments, right? They really don't need much oxygen in order to survive. Okay. So these are considered the primary or the pioneer species. Okay. And they are going to have an autogenic effect. So they are going to drive the succession of this environment by essentially burrowing down into the sediment, therefore allowing more oxygen to penetrate that sediment, right? And allowing that oxygen to penetrate deeper and deeper and more strongly. Right? So ultimately, they are kind of opening up an opportunity for this next group of species. Right? So the species themselves not important for our class, but these guys can handle a middle level of oxygen. Okay? As they exist and they do their thing and they're making a living, just as anyone should, they are oxygenating the soil even more deeply and even more strongly. Therefore, again, opening up the door, preparing this environment, changing it physically for the group 3 organisms. So this is kind of the climax community. We're talking about in terrestrial environments. The climax community needs lots of oxygen, needs a lot of diversity, the conditions that have been created by these 2 groups before them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Cool. And so this is the graph I'm talking about. So the Spreading Dead Zones paper. What the paper was talking about was essentially how human activity, right, so runoff and all of our pests or all of our fertilizer and everything washes into our oceans and essentially takes this nice climax community at the top, right? So group 3 way at the top, which is group 3 way over here, and it essentially rewinds the clock. So our wastewater, our runoff, is essentially acting as a disturbance, right? It's not fire, it's not deforestation. We can kind of visualize those. This is, simple wastewater is acting as a disturbance and making this environment become more and more hypoxic and ultimately anoxic. So no oxygen, less oxygen than necessary. Okay? So we can see that the community composition starts out at these group 3 genera all the way at the top, and then it is going to be pushed down all the way to here. Okay? So there are a lot fewer species that can actually live in those really inhospitable environments. Right? This is surely the most diverse. It all comes back. Okay, so autogenic environmental change is due to the shift in biological community. Allogenic is a result of the physical environment itself. So not really directly changed by biological processes. So we can think back to that zonation. Okay, so this change in temperature with increased elevation, change in wind, change in precipitation. Okay, we can think of a decrease in temperature. So this thermocline is an allogenic environmental shift that can change, right, the successional stage. Over time, of course, climate can change entirely. Right? So climate change is acting as an allogenic environmental change. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about all the ways that climate change is or may affect the parks that you guys have chosen. 1 week from today, just throwing that out there. We'll talk a little bit more about that on Tuesday as well. One other allogenic change that I want to bring up is that the physical landscape or aquatic environment changes also, right? So the land itself, the physical structure, is not constant. One example of this is rivers. Rivers are constantly changing. So what we can see here is that the river starts out with tiny little curves. Okay? On each point, there we go. So as the water kind of wraps around, like maybe there was a rock or something here, water always follows the path of least resistance, maybe tiny little changes in elevation or topography. And so the water kind of winds around those obstructions. In the process, the water on the outside of the bend is going to be moving faster than the water on the inside of the bend. And so all of that alluvial soil, right, so all of the extra stuff that the water picks up along the way, all of that alluvial soil can precipitate out of the water column on the inside of the curve, right? Just because that water is going slowly, and so this allows the sediment to sink to the bottom of the stream. Okay? Over time, sediment builds up over here. Right? Water is not going to go over this sediment, right? It always follows the path of least resistance. And so it is going to go around that sediment, right? Therefore, carving out a little bit of the land over here. Right? So this continues to happen. Carve out a little bit of land over here, deposit some sediment on this side of the bank. Carve out a little bit more, deposit alluvium or sediment on that side of the bank. And so over time, the river meanders, and that is the right word, meanders farther and farther and farther out. Okay, so this land right here has completely changed over the course of, this period of time. Depends on the sediment, depends on the soil type, but this land right here was once underwater. Right, and then it was, maybe splashed sometimes, and now it's completely dry. Right? So the land itself is going to be changed as the course of the river changes. Okay? Sometimes this can become so exaggerated that, again, the river is going to follow the path of least resistance. It is easier for the water to go this way. It might cut through this tiny little strip of land. So it's easier to go over here than it is to go all the way around this curve. Okay, so this can produce something called an oxbow lake. And so over an extended period of time, and again, this depends on what type of soil there is, how easily it is eroded, you end up with a valley with patches of alluvium, right? Maybe with some oxbow lakes, with a river that is constantly changing course because of the deposition of soil on the inside of the curve, right, on the concave surface, and the erosion of the convex surface, so the other side of the stream. So again, this is changing what types of communities can actually live in different places throughout the valley. And so this is, that's so cool.
I like the O.
Yeah,
What's
that's
that?
like modern art, not gonna lie.
It does, but this is the Mississippi River and the history of where it has been over time. Right, of course, in the Great Plains, there's not a lot of bedrock showing. You can really easily erode that soil. And so the Mississippi, before we were constructing bank control, it just kind of did whatever it wanted to, and it has been in a lot of different places. Right? So obviously, whether a particular spot is under the river or used to be under the river, right, that's very much going to change what species can live there. This next example is pretty extreme. This is the Padma River in Bangladesh. Have you guys heard of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't quite see how it's spelled though.
Do I? But Bangladesh?
I can't see how the river name is spelled.
PADMA.
Oh, okay,
I don't know.
okay, thank you.
There we go. So Padma River is in Bangladesh, and this soil in this area is super sandy, right? And in this area, there is no bank control. There are no structures that are limiting the meandering of the river. And so what this what's going to pop up here next is a combination of images from NASA that use shortwave, infrared, and near infrared imaging, right? Just like we talked about earlier this semester, to emphasize the difference between land and water. And this is a 30-year span. And so what I want you to see is just how quickly the river can change. So again, over 30 years, right? You can see it kind of is, contained within this general area, within this little valley, but really quite significant changes. And if you just follow one of these points, you can see that it just moves out and out and out and out and out. And then, okay, now it's easier to flow this way. So then it just cuts off this entire thing and the river kind of goes back to the way it was. Okay? So again, this is only 30 years.